So what Peter and I want to do is sort of walk you through the budget proposal. We're going to try something a little different tonight, and then we're going to sort of start out at a sort of a really big picture focus of how do we get here. You know, what is this 38% growth at the elementary level about? What does all that mean? What does it look like each and every day? So we're going to do some of that as well up front here. But we can get into, you know, if you want to talk about particular FTEs, and I'm sure we will, full-time equivalents, teaching positions, et cetera, we'll get into some of that, but that'll be a little later on, and it'll depend on what you want to talk about. How's that? So we have a short presentation, and then we'll sort of open it up for questions. So, Peter, how do I do this? I do it like that. Yeah. So what I want to start with is to really take you to our core values, the core values that have been arrived at through our strategic planning process that say this is why we're here, right? So we've focused on, and I want to show you some examples of how that plays out. Our core values are focused around high achievement for all of our students, excellence in teaching, collaboration, respect for human differences, and educational equity. And what the slide I like probably of all the slides that we've developed, and we've developed a lot of slides over the last 2 years, is probably this one, which is small, right? And forgive us for that, but really says, so we have a lot of programs and a lot of efforts underway in the district. And this is why they exist. Right? They fall into these categories of supporting these overall goals. They aren't just things that people came along and said, hey, I think it'd be a terrific idea if we focused on X, or if we did some mentoring for teachers. We do that associated with those goals of that strategic plan. So I want to talk about a couple of these, just a couple of these. And you can find these, by the way, all on our website. All these slides and many more slides are available there. So let me focus on a couple of things. Let me start with enrichment and challenge support. So there are some recommendations in the budget proposal, in the one spending plan, the override spending plan, that have come about through a process that's gone on during the last couple of years, which is also highlighted up here, our program review process, which says that that process says we don't just believe that our programs are great and not challenge whether they could be better. We have a rigorous process that occurs every so many years for each of those programs and takes a look at what does the research say about those programs, what's going on in other districts around those programs, and how can we improve them. Right? So enrichment and challenge support, which when I came here was gifted and talented, went through that process a number of years ago. It's how we added FTEs to that program then. But this time was really about how do we take a look at what's going on in gifted and talented programming across the country, because Massachusetts is not your best laboratory for looking at that kind of programming, and make some decisions about things that could make that program better. And a goal that we had in mind, which is really the national conversation, about how do we make that program a driving force in improving situations for all kids, right? And so there are some specific, there are specific FTE recommendations in the budget. And if you're into reading about the 1.5 math specialists and the 1.3 ECS teachers and the 0.4 addition in administration, that's great. That's what gets us to what's actually the most important about that is what are we actually trying to achieve, right? And what we're trying to achieve there is more of a differentiated model for kids. It says that there are certain kids who are in classrooms and they need more of something in those classrooms. So we've applied, for those of you who know special education at all, we've applied a response to intervention model, an RTI model, to this program. So what does that look like? Well, that means that kids get extensions of certain activities, they get more, they get differentiated kinds of assignments, but things that can occur in the classroom. But there are certain kids for whom those kinds of interventions are not necessarily enough. They need something more. So we've talked there about having a coordinator who's in a position to create enhancements, whether they are things like destination imagination for kids, whether they're partnerships with colleges and universities, even for elementary students, right? Or what are those things that would enrich the opportunities for those kids, but can't occur necessarily in the classroom? That classroom teacher doesn't have enough to do that. And then there's level 3, which some of you know, we have one of the very few there aren't very many, opportunities in the Commonwealth where students can grade accelerate or can subject area accelerate. And that's another tier of intervention above and beyond those first two, right? So what happens, though, that's the beauty of this, is to implement such a model. You can't implement those tier 1 pieces of the model without teachers having some enhanced skills. So there's professional learning that goes on for staff around that, and it makes the situation in the classroom better for all. So when I say this is a driving model to really improve differentiation in the classroom, that's what I'm talking about, right? So we think that's an example of high achievement for all, of really enhancing the situation for all students. So that's one example. A second one that feels more mundane to some people is the materials fee program. So, you know, we want to attract, and you want us to attract and retain the best teachers. And I've said at a number of forums that I've done over the last few days, we have challenges around that. Right? So some of you saw an article, and it's a silly one, but I'll highlight it because it's part of the world that we live in. Not as much here as at some other schools, but that world is around an article that you may have seen in the paper around December that talked about parking, right? So we've added students, 38% growth at the elementary schools since 2005. We've added staff. We've built larger schools. That means there are more teachers. That means they need more places to park. We haven't enhanced the parking in terms of garages because that's not been part of any of those projects. Not reimbursable, people in neighborhoods opposed to them, etc. What we can't have is a proposal that says, well, we can't enhance the parking in this area for them, right? And so that's what part of that pushback was about. So we've done some things on that issue. We've started to put some proposals forward. We did it at a great time. February was a great time to talk about encouraging teachers to use public transportation. It was really a terrific time to start that conversation. Really went over well. But even in terms of providing pre-tax passes, right, or allowing them to do that. But there's some other things that we're going to roll out, but they are not going to solve that problem. I will tell you, my colleague in Lexington doesn't have that problem when he goes out to attract and retain teachers. He doesn't have to worry about whether they can park. He has a competitive advantage in that area. And I'm in competition with him for the best teachers. Neither does my colleague in Wellesley, and neither does my colleague in Newton. Right? So there are certain things that we have to pay attention to, and it goes beyond what's in a collective bargaining agreement, which I'm also happy to talk about anytime. Right? And so the materials fee program has really been an enhancement for us. And by the way, the people who say, well, your growth, let's talk about your growth for a second. I think, do you have that slide in there? Yeah. So Peter has a slide that will show you later on that says we've grown 38% at the elementary level. That means about 1,300 kids. And there are people that say, yeah, but what about Metco and what about materials fee? Well, let's talk about those for a second. Metco is the same number that it was in 2005. So that growth has been increased through Metco by 0. 0. There are 100 more materials fee students than there were in 2005. We've grown in terms of our staff, and you know that our staff has got, her parents in particular know that our staff's gotten younger, right? But that's out of 1,300. That's not the problem. That's not the issue. And so programs like that, we believe, enhance our ability, and our teachers will tell you, it enhances our ability to attract and retain. Let me pick one other one and talk about it. English language learner program under Respect for Human Differences. So this is we have a changing demographic in this district. I mean, I have a slide, it's later on in the presentation, I'm not sure we'll get to it, where we broke down the kindergarten class just as an example to people of what this district looks like today compared to 2005. So not only do we have growth, we have a very changing demographic. I forget what the percentage was, it's up here in one of the slides, but of the numbers of students who registered for kindergarten last year, 666 who started the school year, 684 were with us by September 30th. Today it's 703. right? A pretty significant percentage of those kids needed to be tested for ELL services, meaning there was at least a suspicion that they might require ELL programming. That's been up every year. As a percentage, that's increased every year. And people say, yeah, I know how that is in Brookline. You get children of people who move here and they work at the hospitals or the universities and they move from other countries. Yes, but they're not the totality, and they're a lesser percentage of that population than they were 5 or 10 years ago. Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that my ELL population looks like Chelsea's, and you may have seen some of the articles about the immigrant population there, right? It doesn't look like what my friend Mary Bork is dealing with in that district. But more and more of those students are not coming in from environments where their parents work for the hospitals or the universities. And they require a different level of intervention in terms of services, and that changes who we are and the types of services we have to offer if we really believe in respect for human differences. And so those are just 3 examples. I can talk about a number of others if you want as we go along here. Happy to come back to that because I love that slide. We've reformulated strategic plan, we call it strategic plan 2.0, and established these as the goals. And really said now what we need to get to are the action plans around these goals. And many of the things you see in this budget are really the beginnings of or enhancements of those kinds of strategies that have been put in place around these goals of every student achieving, every student invested in learning. I think that ECS conversation that I just took you through is a great example of that. Students prepared for change and challenge, educators growing professionally. I told people this morning in a forum that I was in at Eat School that we have a great set of initiatives and conversations going on at Brookline High School, and one of those is about the senior year, right? Which everyone agrees, me included, as the parent of a 3rd child now in their senior year of high school, is broken. It's broken, right? And some of it we don't control. Some of it has to do with colleges and when all that process takes place, and that by mid-year, I don't know about if you've had seniors, but I'm now on my 3rd, and by mid-year they're done. And so what do we do about that? So I'll tell you the kinds of things they're talking about and the kinds of things they're doing at the high school that my kids went to. In Beverly High School, my daughter is done April vacation. She's done. Other than her 2 AP courses, which have to go on until they take the test, and her chorus class, because they have all kinds of performances at the end of the year. Other than that, she's finished, and she's responsible for an internship. So every high school senior at Beverly High School will spend the last quarter in an internship. Right? And it could be centered around a career goal. I mean, that's a private school model. That's not something new. They didn't invent that. So that's one set of conversations we're having. Somebody this morning suggested that if we did that the right way and spaced it throughout the year so that some kids were in the 1st quarter, some in the 2nd, some in the 3rd, some in the 4th, we'd actually cut down the population at Brookline High School at any given time. Brilliant. I thought that's a great idea. Right? And there are lots of people trying different things like that to enhance that experience for kids, to make it a more meaningful experience, because quite frankly, I can tell you from experience, when those college letters come and we get done with those visits that are going to occur during the month of April, those accepted students visits, it's over. Right? And so what do we do to enhance that experience? That's a conversation going on at the high school, and it's a great conversation centered around these. And so a couple things on enrollment. Our enrollment has grown 38% at the elementary level since 2005. If you're one of those district people, you want to know the district percentage, it's 25.5% at the district level, because the growth hasn't gotten to the high school yet, right? Some people say to me, yeah, but it's a bubble. It's a bubble. Well, first of all, even if we were just talking about what we know of through today, that's a long bubble. And by the way, if we only knew what we know today, we'd be looking at a high school class of around 2,600 by 2022. Right? even if that's all we knew. But we have no evidence that this bubble is going away. People say to me, well, you have no evidence that it's continuing. Only the past 10 years, right, where we've, in terms of our 3-year cohorts, we've increased the number of students every year. So let me tell you about this year, because people say, this year, I wonder what this year looks like in kindergarten. So remember, you may have noticed we had a winter. It was a really not a great winter. We have 16 sessions scheduled at schools to register kindergartners. 4 of them were canceled. 2 at each school, right? 2 at each school, and 4 of them were canceled. And many others occurred, as I told people this morning, when there was 7 feet of snow on the ground and people were trying to take little children to register for kindergarten. So, as one might suspect, our numbers out of those registrations were down, right? There is a steady line at our Office of Student Affairs to register kids now. And I know from today's information there are 22 more appointments scheduled over the next 2 weeks. We're off by about 30 kids. We're off last year's pace right now by about 30 kids. I would have suspected we'd be further off than that, based on the winter we had. Right? I would have suspected we'd be, and remember the pace that we're off. We're off a pace that started at 666, that by the end of September was 684, and today is 703. So it looks like our 650 projections are pretty good, pretty safe, right? And we have numbers that project out that Peter will show you later on that actually project out that way for some time. And so we had a B-space process to look at capital. We can talk about capital issues, we may at some point. Override study that concluded and issued their report in September 14th. And as you know, the Board of Selectmen have placed these 2 questions, one having to do with operating override and one having to do with debt exclusion on the ballot for May the 5th. And so, you know, just before Peter goes into this, which is the sort of the details of the 2 budgets we've created, the position we've been put in is to create 2 budgets. And if you've read the budget message, I'm so sorry. It's supposed to be a little funny. It's 25 pages, has 2 different proposals, one an override, one a no override proposal that really spells out what we need to do. And while you don't need to share in our misery, the fact is that we are now in the process of implementing both, because that's what we have to do. So at the same time that we're looking at consolidations of classrooms in grades 4 through 8, we're also planning what does it look like if we have these enhancements. And so people say to me all the time, we know, this happened to the school the other day, we know that our 3rd grade teacher is retiring. Why won't you let the principal move ahead with replacing that person? Well, it's very simple. Because I don't actually know what the 5 consolidations are, where I place the ECS teachers who are reduced in the no override budget, if that comes to pass. And until I know where they go, I can't let a principal move forward with filling an opening that they absolutely positively know they have today. And I won't be able to give them that permission until we get all those decisions made about where are the consolidations, and until we know exactly where we place every person who we have to place. And then I can give the green light. Somebody said, when will that be? Around April vacation. That's late. Mary would tell you that's late to begin hiring. Her colleagues in other districts are out doing that right now. And we can't. So Peter, I want to ask Peter to take you through the side-by-side. He's created this really wonderful, I think, side-by-side comparison that shows you the 2 different budgets.
So let me start by taking you through the revenue and talking a little bit about the differences. What you'll notice on the first line, which is the town appropriation, is that on the left-hand side is the no override, or what we're calling in this the base budget. And on the right-hand side is what the appropriation will look like if there's a successful override. So the difference is really between the 3.9 million, which is what we're building for a total funding package under a base budget or no override scenario, and the 9 million is what we would expect if there were a successful override. The difference in the town appropriation is that once we use what's called the traditional formula of dividing growth revenue, and these are incremental changes. This is growth revenue change from the current year to next year in both cases. And when we use the traditional model, it would have yielded 3.2 million, but the town administrator indicated after seeing the issues that we were facing that the town would stretch and would actually make reductions in its budget to assist the schools with the enrollment growth, which is really where the pressure is coming from, as Bill said. So that under the no override scenario, the town's making $682,000 worth of cuts and sliding that money, if you will, to the school department. So our base appropriation will be 3.9 million. We'll be making some adjustments to what we've called a one-time money, which is money we have in a fund balance that we've used to supplement our ongoing costs. You can only do that for a short period of time. So our proposal for next year under both scenarios is to reduce from what we had originally budgeted for this year. I think an important point that I don't have a slide on to back up and say is we're working from a premise that this year we'll actually have a spending surplus. It's sometimes embarrassing in the public sector to have a surplus, but we're underspending our budget, which we used about $1 million to support for this year because there were some unknown issues in the budget. So essentially it was taking that money as a contingency. Well, we're not going to need the full 1 million that we originally set aside. We'll need about half of that. So it allows us to spread some of that over the next couple of years as we think about building our budget and maintaining our budget. So we're able to get some of that one-time funding out of our appropriation stream because you can't, for the long-term fund, continuing costs with one-time money. So that's an action we're taking to reduce that. Again, on the base budget or no override, we would use increases in our school rental fees, and these are charges we've made to partner agencies that use our buildings that this year for the first time we're charging. I think Sharon can tell you about that. And you'll notice that under what we call building fee collection or fee collection for next year, we'd probably be increasing that as well. So these are charges that we're imposing on users of our facilities. And then we'll lose some money from a state source for high-cost special education students. We've been successful in bringing some students back from private placements. As a result of that, some of the reimbursement we get from the state on a program called Circuit Breaker is expected to drop. So this is kind of the odd thanks we get for building cost-effective programs. Nonetheless, it's worth doing because we believe we can provide better services in in-house programs at a total lower cost. So that while we lose some revenue on the one hand, we also bring down the cost structure on the other. So it's we think a very efficient way to go. So the contrast is that in an override scenario, the funds appropriated for next year that we add to our budget would be 6.2 million, but we would drop the 682,000, and that money would go back to town services to restore those services. So that's the revenue analysis and the difference under the two scenarios. Let me go. I apologize for how small these are, but these are the summary categories, and then we have some detail to follow. But let's do the left-hand side, looking at the no override scenario. The first item is we'll fund collective bargaining at 1%. That's the current agreement we have with our collective bargaining we have with our teachers union, paying for a mid-year 2% collective bargaining increase for this year. No new increases for next year. Additionally, we pay for the cost of steps and lanes, and that's the way people move on the salary structure. We would fund a $225,000 regular ed contingency. We would set aside $485,000 both for contracted services and as a contingency within special education. We would not fund a benefits contingency. We would fund a $100,000 grant contingency. We would fund what we call enrollment growth. And what I want to point out is that you'll notice what's called enrollment growth is the same under the scenario for no override and override. And that's important for when we talk about some of the consequences of the no override scenario. If you look at the first grouping here, which shows 3 elementary classroom teachers, 2.2 for 7th and 8th grade, some specialists, without going through what we call the full-time equivalents. Notice that the funding under both scenarios is the same. This is the result of building the budget for the elementary schools and looking at what are our current classrooms and what will happen next year as they move up a grade and as we bring in 650 students in 31 sections across the system. An example is Baker School. Baker School has 3 8th grade sections. Under our planning, we believe next year 650 students will bring in 5 kindergarten sections. So that the delta is 2 additional sections next year. So that the funding here for elementary classrooms would fund the 2 regular classroom teachers, and from the special line, that would fund the specialists that need to support those classrooms. And so that scenario is the same because we believe the way that students will move will essentially keep the same number of sections in the current classes that are K to 7, move them forward, but bring in 31 sections of 650 kindergartners at the low end. The issue for our no override budget for next year is you'll notice in the bottom section that begins with elementary teachers and has 5 positions coming out, is that after we first do that analysis of what happens in a steady state scenario of bringing in 650 students, we have to go back and find 5 situations in which we need to consolidate classrooms. And so what we're doing is saying we then have to find, of existing conditions, if we bring in 650 kindergartners, we probably need 31 sections for them. Somewhere in the existing sections, we need to do some consolidation. And that's the point that the superintendent was making a few minutes ago about that's what destabilizes our planning in terms of understanding where that's going to happen at this point, and makes it difficult for principals to make choices on filling positions.
Let me do a second on this. So I want to be really as transparent as I can as to how we'll do this, or how we're doing this. So we've identified right now, I think we're at 14 candidates is a really terrible word, 14 different sections across our schools that sort of fit the basic model of if we, and this is in grade 4 through 8, that if we removed a section, the class sizes would be between 26 and 30. Okay, so that's the basic criteria, right, for doing this. Beyond that, then, we've developed a set of other criteria to look at. How many students in the class in that grade level have IEPs? How many students are ELL? How many students are on free and reduced lunch? What does the MCAS profile of that class look like historically? And what's the teaching experience of the people in the next grade level? I mean, are they all first-year teachers, or is there some experience there? So we're looking at all of those elements, and in the next 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to identify, I hope we get down to the 5. We'll probably get down to 5 to 7, right? We'll probably be more in that range. Because we, again, go back to the point I made earlier, we want principals to be able to begin to make decisions. They can't begin to make decisions until we know where these consolidations would be, right? So, you know, and I can tell you based on the letter I saw today, I will be accused of trying to scare people. Okay, I've already been accused of trying to scare people, right? I'm not trying to scare anyone. I'm telling you what happens if that's the level of revenue that we have to work with. Period. There's a letter up today that I just feel the need to respond to that says, you know, that we wouldn't have to do any of this. None of this would have to happen. You know, we could wait for another question to be posed in July or so, that this 1.15 million is phonied up, and that we could take it out of the things that we've proposed doing and do it that way instead. Okay, so somebody obviously knows more than I know about the legal requirements of schooling and special education and those kinds of things, because that can't happen. right? To do that, I'd have to start up there. So go up there in the no override scenario. And if we want to play a game, we can do this. We can find 1.15 million there instead. So that means that list that Peter showed you around special education doesn't happen, and I'm breaking the law. Because that meant adding classrooms in the RISE program, the autism program at Runkle. It meant adding classrooms in the language-based learning classroom at Driscoll. And again, maybe these people know more about the law than I do in this area, right? But I don't believe we can actually do that. So you can't go there. You can't go there. So maybe they think we should not fund primary level classrooms and we should allow the class sizes to go up there. I'm not sure you would agree with that. I wouldn't. So maybe they don't think we should keep up with the 4-year technology replacement plan that we started last year. Maybe they don't think that the new technologies that we put into some schools, into classrooms, and in the hands of teachers are important. I respectfully disagree. Right? So where's the 1.5? It's not there. We already cut down what we've added to the basic bare elements in that spending plan, and that's how we got to a reduction of only 1.5 that we got to it. So what I've tried to explain to you is the elementary piece. Can I do the other?
Absolutely.
So BHS, what that essentially means, we've cut 5 positions. And right now I can't tell you what they are. Right? But here's what I can tell you will happen. One or all of 3 things will happen. 1, class sizes will go up. Or electives will decrease. There'll be less electives. So possibly less elective classes. That senior year I just talked about, a lot of seniors take electives in the social studies or math area or science areas where we've really created some great, interesting offerings over the last year. Or you have the performing arts or the visual, right? Electives may go, there may be less singletons in particular. Or supports disappear. Tutorial, the whole 4+1 program that allows teachers to support smaller groups of kids, right? One or all of those 3 things happen when we eliminate 5 positions at the high school. Now, I want to be completely transparent. There's probably a person that loses their job in that because we have enough turnover from year to year at the high school that I don't say, I'm sorry, we have to issue a pink slip here because we don't have a job for you in the social studies department next year. But we don't rehire people to replace some of those people who resign or who leave or who we non-renew. That's what happens as a result of that. So that's 2 of those areas. There are others in terms of supplies, in terms of the METCO program, in terms of the elimination of our enrichment and challenge support. I've said to groups, I think there's no more drastic sort of comparison of these 2 budgets than that. In one, I've described to you what I spent the first 5 or 10 minutes here doing, telling you about what we're trying to achieve, how we're trying to use that program as a driving force, right, in the classroom. And in the other, I've said that program doesn't exist. So, is there something else did I interrupt you? Did I really interrupt you? I probably did. So that's a comparison of the 2.
That's okay. Let me just drop back for a second. And because I was talking about the no override scenario, if you take the first 7 items, you'll notice that the major difference is collective bargaining. In the override scenario, we actually set aside a 1% for new collective bargaining for next year. So that's a big difference in terms of our ability to work with our employees. The steps and lanes are the same. The regular education contingency is the same. The special ed contingency is almost the same, but we're talking about a different strategy. In the no override scenario, we're actually putting aside some money because we believe that we'll have an increase in referrals from larger class sizes that we're going to face. So we're doing that under the no override scenario, where under the override scenario, we're setting aside an additional 100,000 contingency because we believe it's a responsible thing to do in that particular environment. Then grant contingency is funded the same in both. Then if you look at the categories they begin to have letters after them, A, B, C, D, E. That's the detail on those areas. The one I went through before on the classroom specialist is the A category. The enrollment-related programs, what you'll notice under the no override scenario is we would increase our current literacy specialist budget, but we wouldn't be able to fund any of those other categories. So that these are areas where we believe there's some significant value, things such as steps to success expansion, professional learning investment, additional money for our repair and maintenance budget, scholarships in our early education program, some investment in language and translation services in English language learners, some before and after school programs, and a large, and you notice at the bottom, a large investment in math specialists and literacy specialists. That's support at the elementary school. So that would give us the opportunity to do some investments in those areas. Under a special education program, while there's significant resources under the no override scenario, you notice that the override scenario has, and the area where there's similarity, notice under elementary special ed teachers, the same investment in classroom teachers, slightly less at the high school under the no override scenario. But our ability to invest more in psychologists, in our assistive technology, and in administrative restructuring, so that there's the ability to put additional dollars into some key services that we believe will really add value. Additionally, under the student service area, you notice there's we don't have the ability to put any money into nursing, guidance, supportive learning centers, or a program called Response to Intervention. You want to speak to that?
I can with a couple of these. So what I think is really key about a couple of areas. Let me talk about the literacy initiative in conjunction with these 5 positions in RTI, Response to Intervention. So very simply put, the goal there is to reduce need in other areas. I mean, the work that we've done in literacy, which is based on the work out of the Literacy Collaborative, in many districts, number that we visited, reduces the need for special educators because it reduces numbers in special education. As I said to a person I was talking to this afternoon, the funny thing with that is we've done a number of things like that, where I'd love to be able to stand in front of you and say, this particular initiative has reduced the need for X because it's provided the supports for kids in Y manner. And the truth is, there's a very important reason why I can't say that about some of those initiatives, because all the savings have been eaten up by the number of new students. So let me give you an example that's off this chart, but really applies to this area I'm talking about. So a number of years ago, when we got money from the federal government, stimulus money, we were to invest that stimulus money in things that would have savings longer term. We invested part of that money in making sure there was a paraprofessional in every kindergarten and first grade. The original model was supposed to be second grade as well. We didn't make it. Kindergarten and first grade. Why did we do that? Because when we studied models that were out there, we found that those districts that were doing that were reducing the number of one-to-one paraprofessionals with kids later on in elementary school. Right? They were not seeing the need. Parents were not seeing the need. The district was not seeing the need in many cases to have a paraprofessional written into the IEP who would accompany that child in 5th and 6th grade. So we said, that sounds like a great investment. Here's the case today. We have about the same number of paraprofessionals today at the elementary level as we had when we started that. So you might say, well, that was a failure. That was a failure. If you have the same number of paraprofessionals, the experiment failed. Remember the number from my earlier slide. We have 38% more students today than we had when we started that. So I would contend it was a success because we would have some number more of paraprofessionals with some number more of cost had we not taken that intervention. The same thing in the literacy initiative. We visited the Sandwich Public Schools a number of years ago when we started this, and they showed me how they'd reduced the number of special educators. And I'd love to say to you in 3 years, that's exactly what's going to happen here. 5 years, that's exactly what's going to happen here. It's not. What we hope is that the numbers don't increase. We hope that initiative controls the numbers, right? We think a better indicator is what happens to the numbers in terms of our percentage of kids who are actually on IEPs, right? Because if I can show you that, like over the last 3 years, the numbers of students who need an IEP in order to get those services, can't get them from regular education, is down, you would probably say that's a success. But if you looked at the raw number, because we've grown by 1,300 kids, you would see that it's up. So some people who are pointing at our numbers say they failed. Right? So we believe the savings is in not increasing in some of these areas. And that's what the Literacy Specialists Initiative is about, and quite frankly, that's what this response to intervention, which is about things like OTs, PT, occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech people who provide those services in regular education before children before they require a legal document in order to access them. It's designed to be preventative in nature. If it's successful and enrollment were flat, you would see decreasing numbers on IEPs. If it's successful, given the growth that we've experienced, you should see that number, right, of special educators not increasing.
And the box at the bottom that talks about the high school, next year we don't expect the high school enrollment to grow very much. This year's 8th grade is approximately the same as the graduating class. So we'd be adding an additional regular ed class equivalency, if you will, at the high school under the override scenario, but otherwise we're looking at a job development half a position and a regular ed
Can I just say one other
yes.
thing about? So just let me say one other thing about this area of special ed. Peter said something earlier that's very important that almost feels counterintuitive. So we've done a great job in special education. Therefore, the state reduced our reimbursement. Right? We've had this conversation going with the legislature where we've said, you do understand that the circuit breaker formula actually doesn't necessarily encourage you to create district-wide programs, bring back kids from out of district. But you do understand that. That's a slight flaw in the formula, right? Now, in truth, you never can get from the reimbursement what you spend on that placement. But here we are saying, we're to one of the lowest numbers the district's ever seen in terms of out-of-district placements. 1,300 kids larger. We have less kids in out-of-district placements today than in 2004. And we're 1,300 kids larger. Right? That's a great success. What it says is we built programs here. So I look at certain things in this budget, and I think we should jump out of our chairs and say, hooray. One of them, strangely enough, it's not up there anymore, is this area of job development. So what that job development coach at the high school means is that we have enough students in that 18 to 22 age range, and they've stayed at Brookline High School instead of needing out-of-district placements. And now they're to the point where they're talking about transition services, transition to what happens beyond school. That's the law. And so now we're talking about job development coaches for them, who help set them up in jobs, who help get them job training, who work with those employers around them making that next logical step. We didn't need a person in that role before last year. We should celebrate the fact that we do now, because it says that kids believe enough in our programs, parents believe enough in our programs, that they're staying, that they want to be at Brookline High School and they want that experience for their children. And they deserve, and by law, they get that experience for their children. That's a success in our special education programming, which actually benefits all of us in so many ways at the end of the day.
And then next year we'll be opening the Old Lincoln School for some of the devotion population. We'll be moving the teaching staff to that building, but the infrastructure, if you will, for things like a building secretary, custodians, nurse, psychologist, we have to staff that building for those students, and then a year from now we'll grow with additional students coming over. The difference in the two plans is a part of guidance counselor cost, a vice principal addition, and some professional development time. So we'll be squeezed on those areas in our base budget scenario. And finally, in instructional technology, as the superintendent said earlier, our investment in some very key areas will be much lower under the base budget scenario. So yeah.
So let me give you an example, a question I was asked this morning. I thought I had a forum this morning, gives me something else to talk about, right? So someone said to me this morning, are we gonna get to the point where we can standardize the learning management system available for grades 6 through 8? And I said, we'd be happy if we could standardize the learning management system available at the high school, because currently we have a lot of people who are using Canvas to communicate with kids and communicate with families, but not everybody uses Canvas. And so in this you did it to me again. I did. In the spending plan, in the override spending plan, we've embedded dollars to create that standardized platform for grades 6 through 12. So that teachers have that ability to use that platform, a Blackboard-like platform, to communicate with students. And the other important part of that is it begins to get us closer to the idea of making sure that all kids have access. So we had quite an interesting conversation over the last year or so with the Override Study Committee. Some people who believe that every kid at Brookline High School already has access. So we did a survey, and we asked our kids at the high school, how many of you have a device that is yours, that you can use every day and bring to school to access your education? 70%. 70%. There are some people who thought it should have been much higher. We predicted up front 70%. Right? That's our student population. So in order to do the kinds of things some people want us to do, in terms of a one-to-one environment, in order for teachers to be able to do that kind of work with students, we need to make sure they have access. This plan does that. So we've made remarkable steps. I've told this story a number of times. A number of years ago, we have a teacher in the language department at the high school who I knew was really playing around, was really interested in the idea of the flipped classroom, right? Flipping what happens, doing things that were more associated historically with homework in class, and creating short videos for kids to watch right at home. Flipping the way instruction worked. And I went to this teacher and I said, everybody talks about the work you're doing. Would you do some professional learning, development and all work for our other teachers in the high school around that? And he's a great guy. And he looked at me and he said, absolutely not. And I said, why not? And he said, because you have no network infrastructure here that supports anything. This is the worst. The wireless environment here is horrible. And I don't do that as much as I'd like to do it here because I can't. Because I can't rely on it. And what happens if that's what I'm relying on and I walk in and the network doesn't work that day, which, by the way, Bill, is most of the time. That's no longer the case. The minute we established that backbone at the high school, I can speak of that as a better example, this stuff took off. And the demand for devices, the demand for professional learning among our high school staff went through the roof. Why? Because we can provide an infrastructure that's kids. That's what this plan does across the district. Not only that, but provides them with the tools, provides them with the professional development that they need in order to make this experience a real valuable learning experience for all of our students. Sorry if we keep doing that to you.
It's okay. I put it back. So let me test something with you, which is let's talk a little bit about enrollment, just to put in perspective.
Can we stop? Are there questions?
Yeah.
Do you have questions on any of that before we go through some of this really fun stuff about how we got here? If you do, just interrupt us, okay?
I mean, there's a lot of exciting things happening, which is nice to see. As much as we're all worried about, what's going on, and it sounds like, I feel like there's a lot of positive things happening.
We have a lot of great things
So
happening.
it's nice to hear that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to the point of this is to frame for everybody why why we believe we need money beyond what the regular appropriation driven by the tax base will allow, which is the Proposition 2.5 issue. An override is an exception to Proposition 2.5, which constrains the amount of revenue the town can raise through its property tax. And since the revenue to the town is generally 70% from property tax, it means that the town has a constraint on it. So the reason that we're having this conversation that says what's the implication in a base budget scenario is because we have growth beyond a steady state. We have growth from enrollment. So this is a slide that just shows over 10 years by school what the bar looks like. That I think gives the visual that everybody's sharing in the pressure. And then if you look at what's going on by grade, you see that the significant difference, Bill mentioned 702, is it?
703.
703. So the kindergarten back on September 30th was 684, is 703 today. But those bars show you that in our K through 5, where we have the over 600, except for that yellow bar, the 4th grade, this is where the enrollment numbers are. And we no longer are in the world of the traditional 400s, which are the 4 classes at the high school. We have these large classes moving through the system, and they seem to be continuing to be coming. This is a chart to show the difference between where we were 10 years ago and where we are today with average class sizes. In other words, if you look at the number 22, that's 22 kids in a class. We have 59 occurrences this year of 22 kids in a class, where we had 22 occurrences back 10 years ago. So it shows you how if you think of it as a histogram, how it's moved, the shoulders moved off to the right-hand side, with average class sizes actually grown. And while we value low class sizes, the pressure from the enrollment growth has really challenged us around that issue. So let's talk about the bubble that Bill mentioned that we don't think we're experiencing. This is a graph that shows kindergarten enrollment beginning in 1960. Okay, so it's 55 years of actual experience and then some projection. And I'm sorry I don't have my pointer, but we're up at the highest point. So that, and what you see is that for the last about 7 years, we've actually been at a level higher than where we were back in the 1960s. So it's hard to imagine that this is really a bubble. I mean, things could change that might affect this, but we believe our permanent new condition is somewhere over 600 students per year arriving. And if that's true, it means that the 600s you see in the purple are going to move forward, and that's where the pressure will continue for the next few years at the elementary schools, and then will affect the high school significantly. Oh, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. This is a graph, again, going back to 1960, that shows our total population and how it's moved, okay? So that the high school is the red, and you notice for the last almost 40 years they've been below where they were in the 1960s. The elementary is the blue bar, and that now, if you see where 2015 is, which is about halfway up through the 5 years of projection here, we're at a historical high, 1,000 kids over where we were in the 1960s at our elementary grades, and again continuing to push forward. So again, when you look at this in perspective of the last 55 years, it doesn't look like a bubble. This is charting with the green bar our average class size today with fully integrated special education students. You notice we've struggled to keep that average class size as low as we can over the last few years, but it's been very difficult. This is to show you why up until 2005, I used to say to the superintendent, I could predict we'd get about 70% of the corresponding birth rate as our incoming kindergarten class, because that's in fact what was going on. You notice that the numbers in the 400s were trailing the birth rate. And then the phenomenon changed beginning in approximately 2005 to the point where a year ago, we actually, was it this year? It's actually this year, we exceeded the corresponding birth rate. So that that's not a ceiling. You're going to have more than 100% of the corresponding birth rate. We actually blew through that this year. So the question is why? And we believe it has to do with housing, with the proliferation of condominiums and how they're valued to families today who are choosing that as a way to move to the community and to have their kids educated in this community. And so the birth rate isn't a good way to track what our enrollment's going to be, because the phenomenon is people moving to the community. So if you take this birth rate and you apply what I call the cohort yield, which is if you look at the pattern for 10 years, for 5 years, is it 5? 10, the average, 4 years, and 5 years, yeah. What you see is that we will, at the very lowest, if you use the 10-year average, we'll have just about 600 kids a year. But we're more probably going to have something that resembles the 5-year or the 4-year, which is in the mid-650s. If we have another year like what we just had, will be that higher number that could approach 700 again. So we don't know where we're going to be, but if the present trend continues, as they say.
Right. The history of the last 2 or 3 years has been closer to that 5-year line.
And if you take those numbers and apply them to Brookline High School, you'll see what happens next year. The green bar is data we talked about a year ago. We then had some attrition actually at our middle grades, so that now we're talking about the blue bar. The point is we're still getting to the same point, about 2,600 kids, about 2,400 in 2022, but we may top out at the 2,600 range in 2024. This year we have 1,885, around 1886. So you see the significant impact on Brookline High School that we have to be planning for. And this mishmash of lines takes the graduating class, beginning with the class that graduated in 2002, and looks backward at what the enrollment of that group of kids was back to their kindergarten time. And so if you look at the first grade, we has historically had some increase from K to 1. If you look at where those cohorts, the grouping of kids, were at their first grade, and then look at where they are at high school, they just about match where they were at 10th grade. If you take all these and average them, whoops, you don't get that, you get this. What you see is that essentially the 10th grade size of that cohort is the same as what it was in first grade. And that's why we believe we can predict that these classes will advance, because historically that's what they've done in this community.
So the other argument we hear often is, yeah, but the kids, they dwindle off, the numbers dwindle off when you get to those intermediate grades and middle grades. Families choose to do this, or they choose to do that. And that's great anecdotal. Everybody has a story, right? What we have is 13 years of data that says essentially your first grade number predicts your 10th grade number, which by the way is a better actually predictor in this than your 12th grade. That's affected by kids who don't graduate on time, those kinds of things. So it's actually first grade equals 10th grade, period. Yes. So I don't think so. I mean, every one of my colleagues, the reason I don't think so is every colleague that I have, that I know of, says that. So kids can't be moving to every one of those towns right? I think what they're actually saying is that there's no doubt that some of that's true because we're associated with the hospitals, and we've heard anecdotally that doctors say to family X,
you should move here, you'd be closer for these services, and they have a great program in Y, right? By the way, terrific. We have recognized great programs. To me, that's terrific. It's exactly where we want to be on everything that we do. But I don't think so. I think there are certain disability types. Well, I know from the national data and from paying attention to those kinds of things that there are certain disability types that we are seeing an increase in this country, and so we are going to see. I've heard that said about our RISE program. People are moving here because of the RISE program, the autism program. Well, my colleague in Westwood says that. My colleague in Lexington says that. My colleague in Newton says that. Right? So they're not moving all those places. I think we're seeing I know we're seeing an increase in numbers of students with that diagnosis. So it may be true for some particular programs, but quite frankly, what we've seen, if anything, I'll give you an example of the language-based classroom at Driscoll and some of our high school programming. We're seeing larger numbers in those programs because before, many people who had children with those needs were saying, well, I think Carroll School or Landmark School make a lot of sense. And many of them are no longer saying that. So I have in this budget an increase in staffing in the language-based program. It's not because of that reason, it's because more people are saying, this is a program that meets our needs. I think we'll stay here because all in all, parents want their kids in the town where they reside for school, if that's at all possible, right? They don't want them on a bus to Landmark, which is where I live. That's a long bus ride, right? So I don't think so.
I was just curious if they had supported that, and if there were any way to offset any of the cost of that by getting a disproportionate amount from the state, if there were, but obviously there isn't that, so.
Yeah, no, I mean, it kicks in circuit breaker. That's where, and there is going to be a discussion of circuit breaker. There is some kind of an increase associated, very small, associated with the Chapter 70 formula and just more students, but it's very, very small. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, these are. Yeah, that question has been asked of us before, and the answer is yes. These are based on classes that graduated, including this year's class, meaning families who started in the community a dozen years ago, right? So that we don't know what the phenomenon will be for these classes that are in, let's say, K5, K6, and whether the environment is different and things will change, and 6, 7, 8 years from now things will be different. We don't know that. What we're saying is this is a pretty strong. There's a pretty strong pattern that's been consistent for many years. We have yet to see any evidence that would indicate that it's going to change.
The difficulty, it's a great question. The difficulty for me in getting my arms around the question is that you'd have to actually replicate some of the other kind of variables, right? The housing, why people are taking that housing, the other kinds of conditions, a more urban kind of situation, which is what we have. And so I'm thinking, the minute I heard your question, I'm thinking, gee, I wonder, because I know there's been a time period in Lexington or Newton, but some of those conditions don't match up at all. They have larger percentages, for example, even though they're very successful systems, they have a larger percentage of kids who choose private options than we do. Historically, our percentage is about 10% who choose private options. That's 5 points under the state average. So there are a couple things that will impact this that we know, both in this district and other districts do, right? So Peter showed you a slide of the school by school. And you may have noticed that at Devotion, unlike the other two large schools, Baker and Pierce, we actually saw a slight decline this year in the population. All right? Very predictable. It's a school headed toward a building project. And when schools head toward building projects, if you go back even in our district and you look at the years preceding the Lawrence project, the enrollment went down. And it went down both in incoming, and we're already seeing that devotion for next year in the incoming kindergarten. It's smaller than we've seen historically, even though the overall population's solid. And you see it during the project, and then what you see is it bounce back plus. You know, they come. I always said they come back and they bring friends, right? That's a norm, and it's a norm that we can factor into some of this. Some people made a big deal out of the fact that at district-wide last year, we saw some downturns in grades 4 through 8. So we dug into the data. Those downturns were almost exclusively at devotion. And then we dug into why they left, and we got some reasoning, which was not about, you know, people choosing private because of what we were seeing. It just wasn't. We didn't see those data that predicted that. So no, I don't think we have those comparisons. Yeah.
I was just going to say one thing, which is the Boston Foundation just put out a report on Boston public schools. I think it was about 100,000 kids in the Boston schools in the 1970s. They're under 54,000 now. And it was at a high of 143,000 even before that, so it's 40 years earlier, in the 1930s. So I think number one, there's just different demographic things happening in our neighboring districts. I think we see a lot of people coming in who are, as Peter said, they're sort of school-aged coming in. A lot of people jump across the line, the Boston line, when they don't get the kindergarten lottery they want or whatever. There are lots of things going on. I mean, one thing that the Override Study Committee did is sort of a demographic analysis of what some of where are some of the people moving, and the condo conversions that Peter was talking about is a big driver of this. And someone once asked, well, there can't be that many more of them to go. Aren't we built out as a town? And so there was a whole discussion of how many more condo are there that could be converted within the zoning, and the answer is a lot.
Say nothing of the Hancock villages of the world.
So not even right. So
Right, which isn't factored in any of this.
There's lots of other ones also, just turning single-family homes into two families, or two families where an empty nester moves out. You cut the house in half. It becomes a two-family condo. You have two families that move in with 3 kids each, and you've gone from 0 kids to 6 kids over the course of a summer, basically. So anyway, for one dwelling, we're not building more. So anyway, it's just all of which is to underscore Brookline's a great town. People want to move here. There are lots of people, lots of reasons they want to move here. But anyway, and different towns around us have different sort of demographic issues.
Somebody else? Did you have a- So we've done some of that, and we haven't done it in a while. This might be as good a time as any to try to do it later on this spring with kindergarten. So we did it for the first. So Peter made that comment about, I used to be able to tell the superintendent, you can right. That was my first year. He told me that 2005, by the way, 2005, when Peter said, very predictable. We get this number. We have this kind of capture rate, whatever, and that's when the enrollment surge began. And then it was 500 students, and we said, wow, the enrollment's really gone crazy on us. 500 students. We long for those days, right? In some ways. We did surveys the first 2 or 3 years of kindergarten families. I'm wondering if it would be terribly different. I mean, we were told by people they were moving here. They were for the schools. They were moving and at that point they were telling us they were moving a year or 2 prior to the oldest child starting school. But the thing that really kind of got our attention were when we started to count up the number of siblings that they reported that they had, right? It wasn't just schools, it was proximity to jobs, hospitals, work, public transportation, sorry. It was those kinds of things they were reporting, that this was a good place to raise children for all of those reasons, close to work, great schools for kids, all those kinds of things. My sense is a number of those things haven't changed in terms of the reasons they would report, but we probably should try to do that again at some point. Yep.
Quick question. Presumably, you guys have taken a look at some neighboring districts and figured out what would happen to enrollment in a no override versus a full override, plus another override, plus another. We've got to do more than one. It's more than just this one coming up in order to make this district work long term. But presumably, there's some sort of differential analysis of what you think the class sizes are going to be in each scenario, because at some point, you believe the class sizes start to go too high.
Right. So we're reporting. I mean, I walked you through that analysis a few minutes ago of if we consolidate 5 sections. You know, there are people who've said to me, "Well, you do know that they won't actually be at those numbers because people are going to make other choices at those numbers, right?" And that's true. We really don't have any data. I mean, I can look at what happened in Newton some number of years ago with their failed override. They did operate class sizes in those grade levels, a large number of them, at sort of the 27, 28. It led to a successful override X number of years later, and many people talk about that experience as how they got there.
Yeah, I very much like your approach. And we have a set of core values, and we're going to live up to those core values. We're not going to let that happen.
Right.
But you know, what happens to class sizes, or what happens to total enrollment if everything goes through and other neighboring communities maybe don't keep up? I mean, we could continually undershoot the mark.
There are people who believe, you know, that for every person who says this is a bubble and you people haven't figured out when it goes away and you should be figuring that in and you're misleading people by setting a new norm at 650. There are those people who say, well, what if a year from now we're having a conversation that 700 is the new norm, right? And I can't tell you that it's not. I mean, I didn't think that we'd hit a 700, and quite frankly, 2 of the last 3 years we've been past that new mark that we've set of 650. 2 of the last 3 years.
I believe that looking backwards undershoots the mark. I think we should be
Yeah.
a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
And we should be looking for a little bit more.
Well, and as I said in a forum this morning, right? So the people who say that's ludicrous, you're going to overbuild, you're going to do this. I've said, so let me tell you the worst thing that happens, again, elementary wise. Ready for this? This is the worst thing that happens if we overbuild our elementary schools. You ready? We get to bring back our early education classrooms and stop paying $500,000 in rent. That's per year, which by the way is about to go up because we're about to rent more space for Pierce School. We're about to look at some office, right, where that rental is going to go up. So that's what would happen. We'd be able to bring that back, those early education classrooms, to elementary schools. Oh, the horror, right?
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we wind up also to charge taxpayers a little bit more money, and we have a little bit more room to breathe.
Yeah.
If we under move in this direction, and we don't have the core values.
Well, let me just.
That's what
I get it, and so there's also these 2 other conversations going on because you're talking about future questions, and again, I'm telling you, we believe there are some initiatives that actually hold down numbers over time. We haven't built some of those into the models, but we believe that happens. There is a conversation. It'll actually be before the school committee tomorrow night in a presentation around the high school and just the work that's been done to date on the kinds of modeling that we're looking at. So we're essentially looking at 3 buckets of models. One involves, can you build on to Brookline High School? Can you create what you're trying to do programmatically? Can you create it there on that campus? And there are challenges around that, as there are challenges in all 3 of these. Second is, should we be building a second high school? Should we have a second Brookline High School? And there are challenges around that, starting with where would be a good question, that kind of thing. And then the third is, do you do something different than that? Do you look at what you have that's within some proximity of the high school, like the OLS building on a long-term basis, and do you locate some particular program or grade level there? Now, it's true that you can't make that a 9th grade school in the present building, but what if you were to build
right? What if you were to enlarge? Could you create a 9th grade campus? Would you want to? Or would you rather look at something like the school within a school model? Or would you rather look at something like, you know, the science, technology, engineering, arts, math, STEAM initiatives in a particular location, right? So that's high school for a second. But in the elementary, you know, the school committee and board of selectmen have also authorized this study of a 9th school location. And the only thing I want to say here to that is I think we all have to sort of broaden our thinking. Because if we're thinking what I want that study to come back with is another location for another neighborhood K-8 school, you're going to be very disappointed, in my view. But if you say, I'm open to the possibility, right, of some space that may be mixed use, right, which is what they're doing in other urban environments with other they're doing it with senior centers, they're doing it with rec centers, they're doing it with libraries, they're doing it with businesses. If you're open to that kind of concept, if you're open to the idea of a more urban kind of school, playgrounds on roofs, right, which is what they're doing, if you're open to some kind of school, whether it's K-8 or some other grade configuration that is more of an application, that is more of some school centered around a particular concept, whether it's the arts, whether it's technology, right? Then we can have some great conversations. And that doesn't have the same sort of demands on it, and it can draw from all over town, and it has to be built, and the program has to be built equitably so everyone has access and all of those kinds of things. But then you can have some more, I think, much more interesting conversations around the possibilities, right? And it may look different in terms of the way you build and how you build and what your relationship looks like with the MSBA because of the creativity in that kind of discussion. So yeah, you're right. We have a lot more conversation to have, and some of it's about the high school because there's staffing yet to come there that we know of that we haven't programmed into this 3 year. That'll have to play itself out over a little bit more time. We are sort of about to re-engage ourselves in the model. We built this budget model through FY22. It was great fun. And we're about to sort of go back at that and lay out years 2 and 3 in this model, and then really take another crack at looking at what we think comes from 19 on, so that people have that kind of information in front of them as well.
None of these charts should include right?
None of them do,
Why is that?
because to date as we've built them, we don't have numbers. Now as we begin to get a little bit more idea of numbers, as we begin to get a little bit better idea of years, right, we can begin to create some approximations in that, and we're closer to that information than we've been. We just worry. You stop right there. Yes, we worry. Yes. We worry about this piece of unknown information, right? We worry about this school. We worry about what that means in terms of overall plans. Yeah, yeah, of course. High school and elementary. Yeah.
Just one other note on that, besides the fact that we worry. We're excited and we worry.
Yes.
I think part of the question that has been, the school committee has tried to answer as we've processed our mind through this is, how much do we need, how much do we know we need, and how much might we need, and how much do we want, right? And those are 3 different sorts of things. And clearly there's a lot of, without getting too political about it, I mean, what the school committee's thought is that this is what we need, right? This is what the superintendent thinks we need. Some of these programs are extensions of programs that we have now, but they're what we need for the time period and the kids we know we have. This isn't some wish list, this isn't conjecture, the kids are in our buildings, this isn't anticipated future growth, this is what we know we need over the next 3 years. You know, the question of might we need another operating override after that, might we need another capital override after that, all those are important conversations to have. certainly for capital, in terms of a high school, in terms of a ninth school, those are additional expenditures that are needed. But I think it's an interesting question of how you budget. When you say, we know there are things out there that we want to do, we know there are things that might be coming down the pike, we don't know what they are, so we want to keep them in mind and keep them in sort of the broad vision. But in terms of like actually going to the voters and saying, here is what we think, like here's what the need is, that's kind of what this is. So hopefully it's kind of an answer to your question, but yes, we think about that, and it's not built into this budget because there are too many unknowns on it.
I want Peter to have a chance. There's a couple more slides on sort of spending per student. So
Yeah, and this actually does relate back to the question of spending, because we have modeled out what the impact is going to be over the next few years as costs grow, and it's significant, and so it probably outstrips the community's ability to pay under normal circumstances of revenue growth, and that's really been the issue that's faced the school department. This is actually a slide taken from a report that the Override Study Committee did. And they were, I think their goal here was to try to show that every kid has a cost, and they were talking about, you know, whether you're a regular ed, whether you're a resident kid or a Metco kid or a materials fee kid, there's a cost of serving you, and I think we recognize that. But what it shows, a couple of things. One is that on this period from 06 to 14, what they were saying was our enrollment grew just about 22%. Our inflation adjusted, key piece here, our inflation adjusted spending grew 18%. And our average per pupil cost actually dropped, right? So one of the things that we want to remind people of is what I added, so I went back and I added actually a column here to show the relationship between the per pupil cost over those years. And what happens is exactly what you'd expect, which is in 09, there was an operating override. We extended the school day. We added elementary world language, and our actual cost per pupil rose to about 103%. But over the period of time through last year, and 04 was last year, we actually degraded, if you will, to 97%. So we're spending less per pupil during that period of time. That's because of the pressure of serving more kids, and even though our budget's growing, it wasn't growing as fast. And so that speaks to this issue of, you know, what is enough. You know, we're not here to tell you, but we're here to show you what we believe we could do. This is another source that really confirms the same data. In this case, so the analysis you saw was done by some members of the Override Study Committee, taking basically our raw numbers over time and playing with them and coming up with the analysis. This one takes the blue line, which is what we receive back from the Department of Education every year when we file our financial reports with them. They publish what they call standardized per pupil spending numbers that are so that they can compare across communities, and they're the same basket of items. And what it shows when you do an inflation adjustment is that 06 at 12,959 is essentially the same as last year at, what was that, 12,898? So in other words, those numbers show the same thing. So that I think one thing that's important to try to let the community understand is that our cost growth during this period of time is not because we've been inefficient or because we've been profligate in some way. We believe we've been striving to provide good services, good quality of services. We had a lot of pressure from more kids that we need to serve, and we think that the data shows that. Again, you notice in 09, those curves jumped up because that was the override that infused some more money. But then on a per pupil basis, you begin to see that curve come back down. So, yeah.
Have you ever split this graph between fixed and variable expenses?
No. We really haven't picked it apart to that extent yet. One thing we did show, though, was an area where we've had some success is what Bill mentioned earlier. In our total special education program costs, because we've been able to retain in the last few years a number of students who we previously had been sending out to private placements. We've been able to slow down the annual growth amounts, and you notice after FY10, when we grew in 9 and 10, 11% and 10%, the annual growth of that total budget has been, in the threes it was 4.7% in 14. So we've been able to hold that number down primarily from building programs internally in Brookline, in our schools, and retaining students here. So that's been very successful in terms of managing costs and providing quality programs in the least restrictive environment, which is the core program goal. And finally, this shows our actual enrollment from 05 to today in the light blue. And so what you see is that we have 54 kids K to 8, 1893, at least when we did this, 9 to 12. So as we project forward, we still think, using the numbers we've shown you, with 650 kids coming in, we'll have about a 50% growth by 2022 at our elementary schools. That's about another 500 students, and so that's why we're opening 4 classrooms at Lawrence next year. That's why we're, I believe, putting in a couple of portables here, although that's not going to solve the problem here long term. That's why we're building the devotion school larger. It's why we're renting space adjacent to the Pierce School, where we're going to actually put classrooms next year. So we're continuing to struggle with where we're putting all our elementary students. But that's what the numbers will look like if we bring in 650 kids in.
So just one thing about that I still find amazing every time I see. So this is now the 13th largest school district in the Commonwealth. People don't think about our school district that way. If those numbers are right, by 2022, if I remember these numbers correctly and the direction that some of those other districts are going, I think we're up to 10. I think we'll be somewhere in the neighborhood of 10th or 11th largest district in the Commonwealth. And again, people don't think of, we pass, my colleague in Taunton and a couple of other places during that time frame. And people don't think of that size of district, and that's where we are. And that doesn't include pre-K, right? Does not include pre-K, and we have a substantial pre-K program that we very much believe in. I know parents very much believe in, that serves almost 300 students in addition to those numbers. Any other questions you'd like to ask? Yes, ma'am.
In your various forms, where are you getting the grade, in what sort of top program are you getting the most pushback? Is it artificial projections or you get these, what do you think, you stand for people pushback on?
I've not heard pushback on the projections any longer. Accepted. That's I've not heard, and I think maybe I'll answer this better than I think this has been vetted over and over again. The Override Study Committee report says what Peter said earlier, that the Override Study Committee did not find waste in our budget. We're not out there creating. I think the word that I've seen used recently that makes me bristle more than a little bit is wants, right? That some of what we put forward is about the superintendent and the school committee's wants. It's no such thing. It's no such thing. I've said to people, I have a list of wants. I'm happy to show you. Right? Right. Right.
across the street. And moves across the street.
Across the street, and it's told, well, you know, we don't get full acre. But it costs us. Those are not, that's not the kind of school system we want. We really want a school system where you think about education, where you think about equity, where you think about diversity. And so when I listen to other people talk about this, I think that they're just, they think we are making progress, that there are things we can do.
Really doesn't matter.
Absolutely.
I will.
Well, I mean, I think we're wrong when we say we didn't have great schools, and you guys don't have to try to pay them to build them, and that's why people come here. And it always bothers me when everyone's trying to point the fingers and why did you do this and why did you do that. We have a fantastic school system, I'm an education consultant, I can compare other places, and this is where we find ourselves. So we want to continue to maintain the school system. I would take everyone to see the presentation to show how much you work with the numbers, how you keep things tight, and how much you use so little money, and how you continue to carve out spaces that don't exist to stretch the goal. I don't think people understand that. And that's what's frustrating for me when I read the letters and the postings that people are working on their own agendas that really have nothing to do with what's reality of the situation. So I just want to make you guys really stick around and seeing this through and taking the heat. And I just hope everyone take a breath and realize this is what we need to do for all of us. You know, we'll all rise together if we pass the over.
Thanks, Will. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's a good one to end on, huh?